On the day we buried my father, a woman I had never seen before walked up to me at his graveside, took my hand, and said the words that would end the only version of my family I had ever known. She said,
"You don't know me, but I raised his 2 children too."
I stood there in my black suit, holding a folded funeral program with my father's smiling face on it, and I felt the ground underneath 42 years of memories quietly give way. I had just lost my father. In the same breath, I was about to lose the man I thought he was. My name is Daniel Whitfield, and for 4 decades I believed my father, Robert Whitfield, was exactly who he showed us he was. A devoted husband to my mother, a man who never missed a Sunday dinner, a man who called every night at 6 o'clock sharp, no matter where his job had sent him that week. What I didn't know, standing in that cemetery in Ohio, was that the same 6 o'clock phone call was also being made to another house, in another town, to another family who called him by the same name I did. Dad. Who was this woman standing at my father's grave? How did a man who worked the same job for 30 years, who came home every weekend, who never once raised his voice, manage to build an entire second life without either family ever crossing paths? And what was the real reason he made that phone call every single night at 6 o'clock, a habit my mother always called sweet, and which I would soon learn was the only thing keeping 2 separate worlds from colliding? By the end of this story, you'll understand why my father did what he did, and you may find yourself asking whether you'd have made the same choice, or whether you'd have had the courage to tell the truth while you still had the chance. To understand what happened at that funeral, you have to understand who my father was to the people who thought they knew him best. Robert Whitfield grew up in a small town outside Dayton, the son of a machinist and a schoolteacher, the kind of upbringing that teaches a man to work with his hands and keep his feelings to himself. He met my mother, Carol, at a county fair when he was 22, and according to every story she ever told me, he made her laugh so hard on their first date that she spilled lemonade down the front of her dress. They married a year later. My father took a job as a regional sales manager for an industrial parts company, a job that had him driving through 3 states every week, staying in motels I couldn't have pointed to on a map if you'd asked me. As a kid, I thought that was just what dads did. They left on Monday morning and came home Friday night, tired, smelling like gas station coffee, and full of small gifts and bigger stories. He coached my little league team on the weekends he was home. He taught me to change a tire in our driveway when I was 14. He was, by every account, my mother, my sister, and I could give you, a steady, quiet, dependable man. Before we go any further into this story, I want to know where you're watching from tonight. Before we dive deeper, let us know in the comments where you're watching from. We'd love to hear from you. And don't forget to hit that subscribe button so you never miss any of our upcoming videos. Because the man I just described to you, the steady father, the reliable husband, was only half of who Robert Whitfield actually was. The other half of his life was being lived 200 miles away, in a small house outside Columbus, where a woman named Denise Carver believed just as completely that she was his wife, and where 2 boys, Michael and Ethan, grew up calling him dad on the exact same weekends he was supposedly on the road for work. My father died on a Tuesday morning in March, of a heart attack, alone in a motel room he had checked into the night before under his own name. The same as always. My mother got the call first, then me. We spent the next 4 days doing what grieving families do, choosing a casket, writing an obituary, calling relatives, trying to hold each other up. Nothing about those 4 days felt unusual, because nothing had happened yet to make us question the man we were burying. The funeral was held on a Saturday, at a small church my father had attended his entire life. The pews were full. Friends from his bowling league, co-workers who'd known him for 20 years, cousins who'd driven in from 3 states away. I stood at the front with my mother and my sister, and I remember thinking that if nothing else, my father had been loved by a lot of people. What I didn't notice, not until much later when I replayed that day over and over in my mind, was a woman standing near the back of the church for the entire service, a woman none of us recognized, with 2 teenage boys beside her who kept their eyes fixed on the casket the same way I did. She didn't approach us inside the church. She waited. She waited through the eulogy, through the hymns, through the long line of handshakes and hugs at the reception line. And she waited until we reached the graveside, until the casket had been lowered and the first handful of dirt had been thrown, before she finally stepped forward, took my hand, and said the words that started all of this. "You don't know me, but I raised 2 of his children too. For a moment, I thought I had misheard her. Then she reached into her purse and showed me a photograph. My father, unmistakably my father, standing in front of a Christmas tree with his arm around her, and the 2 boys, taken 4 months earlier, on a weekend I remembered clearly, because it was the same weekend he told my mother he had a work conference in Pittsburgh. The days that followed were some of the strangest of my life. My mother, who had just buried the man she'd spent 40 years married to, now had to sit across a kitchen table from a woman who had spent the last 16 years believing she was married to that same man, even though no legal marriage between them ever existed. We compared calendars. We compared photographs. We compared stories our father had told each of us, and slowly, piece by piece, a second life came into focus, one that had been running parallel to ours since before I graduated high school. Denise told us she'd met my father at a trade show in Columbus, that he'd told her he was a widower, that his first wife had died of cancer years earlier, and that he simply wasn't ready to remarry, which was why, in 16 years, he'd never once put a ring on her finger, despite calling her his wife to everyone in that town. She showed us school photos of Michael and Ethan, report cards my father had signed, a birthday card in his handwriting that used almost the exact same words he'd written in a card to me 2 years earlier. It became clear, the more we talked, that this wasn't a brief affair or a moment of weakness. This was a second household, a second family, sustained for over a decade and a half through a level of planning and discipline that honestly none of us could reconcile with the man we thought we knew. We started digging through his things, his old planners, his phone records, his bank statements, trying to understand how he'd managed the money, the time, the lies, without either family ever once suspecting. What we found instead complicated the story even further. There were medical bills, large ones, going back nearly 5 years, all addressed to Robert Whitfield, all from an oncology clinic in Columbus, none of which my mother had ever seen or been told about. My father, it turned out, had been diagnosed with a slow-moving form of cancer 5 years before he died, a diagnosis he never once mentioned to my mother, my sister, or me. When we asked Denise about the medical bills, her face changed in a way I still think about. She told us my father had confided in her about the diagnosis almost immediately after receiving it, something he apparently never found the courage to tell the family he'd built his entire public life around. According to Denise, he made a decision in the months following that diagnosis, quietly restructuring his finances, adjusting 2 separate life insurance policies, and working extra shifts under a private consulting contract that neither family had ever heard about. Also that both households would be financially secure after he was gone, without either one having to know the other existed while he was still alive to manage it. It wasn't a confession of love for one family over the other. It was, in his own strange and deeply flawed way, an attempt to protect both of them from a truth he believed would destroy everything, right up until his final moment. Denise told us he'd asked her, more than once in his last year, whether she thought he should tell us the truth. Every time, according to her, he decided the risk of losing both families in one conversation outweighed the guilt of carrying the secret a little longer. He ran out of time to make that choice for himself. We made it for him, at his graveside, without any warning at all. In the months since the funeral, something happened that none of us expected. My mother and Denise, 2 women who by every reasonable measure should have hated each other, began speaking on the phone. Not often, and not easily, but enough that by the following spring, my sister and I found ourselves at a small backyard gathering that included Michael and Ethan, the 2 half-brothers we never knew we had, sitting at the same table, eating the same barbecue, trading stories about a father who had somehow shown up fully for both of our childhoods, even while dividing himself in 2. I won't pretend it made sense of everything he did. It didn't, and honestly, some days it still doesn't. But I've come to believe that my father wasn't a monster hiding behind a mask of decency, and he wasn't a saint who made one terrible mistake. He was a deeply human man who made a choice at 20-something that he never found a way out of, and who spent the rest of his life trying to be enough for 2 families instead of finding the courage to be honest with one. I buried my father believing I knew every version of him there was to know. It turns out I only knew the version he let me see, and somewhere out there, 2 boys I'd never met were saying the exact same thing about the man they called Dad. If you were in my position, sitting at that graveside, hearing those words for the first time, I want to know honestly, Would you have wanted the truth the moment it happened, or would you have understood, even a little, why he chose to protect two families the only way he knew how? Tell me in the comments below. And if this story stayed with you, wait until you hear what happened when another family in Texas found a locked storage unit their father had paid for in cash every month for 22 years. If stories like this one keep you watching until the very end, make sure you're subscribed, because there's another one waiting for you right now.